Can you all hear me with the fan going? Okay. So tonight, I'm going to be talking about the music of Prohibition. Mia explained a little bit about the genesis of how this came to be, but I do sing songs from the 20s to the 60s, and so when we talked about doing a talk, I was like, I know all about those songs, and in fact, I do know a lot of the songs, and so do you. But as I found out, researching this talk was very interesting because I actually didn't know a lot of stuff. So, okay, so just, so this is the Charleston. See, I have to do this. This is probably the most famous song that Prohibition is known for, right? And it was, and that was written by a guy named James B. Johnson, who we will talk about. So, okay, so now let me get my technology. So, when I started thinking about the songs, I thought, well, let me look at what was going on song-wise in the decade before that. And so I don't know, should we keep these lights on or should we turn them off?
Keep them on.
Keep them on? Okay. Can you all see? All right, so many of the songs you all recognize. Alexander's Ragtime Band, Over There, Let Me Call You Sweetheart. And then if we jump to the 20s, your Swanee, My Blue Heaven, Ain't Misbehaving. So I thought, well, I can't really talk about the songs, because if I'm going to talk about the songs, I'm going to say, here's a list, y'all know it, that's the end of the talk. So I decided what I really needed to do was talk about the why of the songs. Like, why were the songs of the 20s in the 20s? It sounds like a repetitive question, but it isn't. So let's go back and let's examine things. So one of the questions I had is, what was going on before radio and the phonograph? Because we're all used to that, and radio was out in the 20s, as was the phonograph record. So what were people doing prior to that? Well, they had pianos in their parlors. You've probably heard about that, through whatever stories you read. But the golden age of the piano was actually in this time period that I have up here, and there were hundreds of piano manufacturers. It's hard to imagine now. Sometimes you'll go to like a flea market or something and you'll see some odd piano name and you'll be like, what's that? It's not Steinway, it's not Baldwin. Well, and most of the piano manufacturers were in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, which is where I'm from. And, I guess there's a reason. So the other thing about, so people had pianos. There was no radio, there was no phonograph. So what did they do? They had to buy music. And so sheet music publishing was this incredibly lucrative, it's hard to believe now, but it was a big money-making deal. And if you went into Woolworths, which existed then, or Macy's, which existed then, they had whole departments of sheet music, which is kind of amazing. Now, so I think that's kind of interesting. However, and they advertise things like, what is a home without a piano? And so they always had a piano in the parlor. However, not everybody was able to play the piano, which we come to, but... And here's a typical, so this is actually, Shoot & Butler was a piano manufacturer from Indiana, and there's a lovely domestic scene, sort of the ideal. And this is the kind of music that you might hear in the home parlor. It's always by Irving Berlin, which probably a lot of you know. Right? Not what you think of when you think of the smoking hot jazz in the 20s, but in fact, Irving Berlin was the most prolific composer of songs during the 20s. Irving Berlin was a Jewish immigrant from Siberia. I'm thinking of Serbia, that's over there. Siberia. He was the son of a rabbi, and his name was Israel Belin. And he came here with, trying to make his fortune, and started writing songs, and he changed his name first to Izzy Berlin, and then later on somebody published a sheet music, I Berlin. He's like, okay, I got this, I got Irving. That's one thing to know. The other thing is, this song, to go back to it, this kind of, let's call it a nostalgic song. It's sort of a sweet, sentimental, maybe sappy, but that's a song that runs through the 20s too, and you'll see some of those. Vaudeville was the other big way that music got around. There were lots of traveling. I mean, vaudeville was obviously in New York and other big cities, but it was where they had traveling troops, and they would bring new songs to town, and they would, people would go to the shows, and there were any different kind of show. Let's take a listen.
If I got to Broadway, remember me to Harold Square. Tell all the gang at 42nd Street that I
Oh, you know the words. It's great. So that's from 1904. That's George M. Cohan, whose statue stands in Times Square. He wrote Yankee Doodle Dandy. He wrote Your Grand Old Flag. And James Cagney starred as him and won an Oscar when he played him in, I think, the movie's Yankee Doodle Dandy. But there was really a need for songs because these shows were being put on and they were sending people out to perform them, and there were other things going on, very important things. So let's look at some of the things leading up to Prohibition. 1878, 1880, Alexander Graham Bell telephone and microphone invented. That's going to be important. The gramophone disc replaced the wax cylinder. That would enable people soon to have gramophone discs in their home. Radio started. It wasn't like, commercial. It wasn't something that people were bringing into their homes, not in 1904, but it was around. Immigration hits a record 1.3 million in 1907. That's a very important point. And I have to bring it out, it was legal immigration at that time. And later on, when World War I came in, they started limiting, the United States started limiting, how many people could come in. And of course, it was very racially oriented at that, anyway. That, back then, they started to, but 1907 was the immigration record, 1.3 million. The Ziegfeld Follies began on Broadway, which lasted all the way till 1931. And you probably are familiar, but he did these gigantic extravaganzas involving music and girls and dancing and acrobatics and whatever. And they were always looking for new music and new acts. And but he was kind of the biggest guy. He always had like the million dancing girls, Flo Ziegfeld. And he was an immigrant from, I think he was from Russia. Another thing that happened, we'll talk about it a little more, is the Great Migration begins in 1910. That was actually the migration of blacks from the South, West, and North. We'll talk about that. 1911, radios start to appear. 1911, Alexander's Ragtime Band became a big hit, and that was Irving Berlin, of course. Henry Ford starts an assembly line, that's going to be important. And D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation came out. Now it's still considered an epic film. It was probably the most racist film ever made. And it actually kind of glorified the Ku Klux Klan, and it made it more difficult for blacks in the South to live. And so that movie actually helped spur migration from the North to the South. Right. No music on that one. So this was Izzy Berlin's first hit. You all know this song. And some of you know the words, that's great. Okay, so just some facts. 1 million copies of sheet music were sold, another million the following year, and started a ragtime craze. Now, craze is a word from the 20s. All kinds of crazes started. Ragtime is actually a black music. I mean, it comes from black culture, and we'll talk more about that, but just the fact, and it's not exactly a ragtime song, it sounds more like a march, but the very fact that it had ragtime in it started this ragtime craze, which is good. It's good. So now I'm going to play another version of it. This is just a few years later. Bessie Smith, who was with the Moses Stokes Vaudeville Act, she recorded it. This is a recording from 1927. Now let me just say a word about vaudeville. Vaudeville was kind of anything goes, and it was one of the only venues where immigrants and blacks were able to kind of make a decent wage. And blackface, of course, you all know about blackface, but they had blackface with white performers in blackface, and then they had blacks in blackface going out. Yep, that's true. So here she is singing.
Come on in here, Alexander the ragtime band. Come on in here, it's the best band.
A couple of different things going on. First of all, there's like a tuba accompaniment. There's a little bit more of a beat. And listen to her voice. That's a real vaudeville voice. They didn't use any microphones back then, so it's a big voice.
And in the land, listen to the bugle call. Yeah, the best band in the land. Oh, honey, let's come on along. Come on.
So, going back for a second to the new technology. So the sheet music publishers, much the way book publishers were worried about the internet, probably still are, they were really worried about the phonograph when it came out. And Edison, in this ad, he calls it the cheapest talking machine. I mean, they didn't really... So what happened is a lot of sheet music publishers actually started making their own phonographs. This model that I'm showing is Thomas Edison's model. And the other thing they were really worried about was radio, which, justifiably, probably radio did take away from sheet music sales. But remember, radio was not commonly used. It was not in households. However, the publishers were already worried about it. So this is a piece of sheet music from 1911 featuring Sophie Tucker, who was a huge vaudevillian star, and they're already advertising. Radio's big hit, even though radio really wasn't around. And so, listen to Sophie.
I hope you'll never forget to remember me when you...
Huge voice, right?
Some of these days, you'll be so lonely.
She's on a recording.
Some of these days,
She's performing.
you'll miss me, honey. You'll miss my hugging. You're gonna miss my kissing. You're gonna miss me, honey, when I'm far away.
So she did not transition into the microphone era. Well, she did. She was another Jewish-Ukrainian immigrant who immigrated to Boston and quickly came down to vaudeville. And she was a big star. I mean, the sheet music publishers are using her for, to advertise this song. Okay. Not even following my notes. How cool is that? We also had the less refined form of vaudeville, burlesque. And in this case, I'm showing two pictures of Theda Bara, both of these ladies went on to be big silent film stars, Clara Bow and Theda Bara.